water, earth, fire, air. Long ago,
Like, almost 20 years ago at this point, creators Michael DiMartino and Brian Konietzko set out to make an animated series meant for kids and ended up sculpting a masterpiece that almost 2 decades later is not only still loved by those who watched it weekly, but continues to capture the hearts of new generations that find their way to the show. This series was, of course, Avatar: The Last Airbender, a show produced by Nickelodeon that boasted deeply intellectual and incredibly mature themes that were still easily accessible to a young audience.
Affection and power are overrated. I think you are very wise to choose happiness and love.
It did so by giving its viewers something fun and relatable to watch while always treating them with respect. It never doubted that its adolescent audience was capable of understanding and digesting themes that many other shows would have said were too mature for kids that age. I mean, this show rocked. No pun intended. From character arcs that not only made sense but paid off in big ways to absolutely heart-wrenching moments that
Leaves from the vine, falling so slow.
No, please, I can't. I'm not emotionally ready to go through that again. Please, no. The point is, Brian and Michael struck gold from 2005 to 2008, and since then, multiple attempts to recapture lightning in a bottle have always seemed to at least fall a little flat, or in the case of the first attempt, very flat. And that's kind of putting it kindly. I mean, quite frankly, this movie doesn't exist in the eyes of everyone. It's safe to say that director M. Night Shyamalan's take on the source material didn't resonate with fans of the show. So much so that nearly a decade after its release, when news of a new live-action adaptation broke to the public, fans were skeptical, to say the least. I mean, when something like this exists, it's kind of hard to not be overly protective of the thing that it's based on. Like, who the fuck let him do this? Ugh.
No, Hitchcock and Kurosawa and Stanley Kubrick, these are like my teachers.
And if that weren't bad enough, when word spread that the original creators would be parting ways with the new production due to disagreements with the Netflix team, fans were already waving the white flag, surrendering hopes for an accurate and tasteful live-action depiction of their favorite characters. Ironically, pulling a line from the new series, sometimes hope can be a cruel thing. When the duo announced their departure from the series, Brian took to Instagram to answer a few questions about how they arrived at this decision, essentially saying, "When Netflix brought me on board to run this series alongside Mike 2 years ago, they made a very public promise to support our vision. Unfortunately, there was no follow-through on that promise. Though I got to work with some great individuals both on Netflix's side and our own small development team, the general handling of the project created what I feel was a negative and unsupportive environment." Oof. That really sucks to hear. Between that and the lackluster trailers and the news about sanding off the edges of one of the show's key players, Sokka, essentially lessening a key element of his character throughout the series, it's safe to say that the new series wasn't off to a great start in the eyes of the public.
I mean, it's alright, like, overrated as in my opinion. I mean,
but now that the gang have finally made their Netflix debut and I've watched all 8 episodes, and there's a bit to unpack. Is it this abominable train wreck many of us thought it was going to be? No, not at all. It's surprisingly halfway decent, especially when we get into the mid to late episodes of the season. I mean, barring the season finale. There was an attempt to tell a different kind of story, which I very much appreciated. A war story when compared to the original show, and that was definitely a smart move in giving this adaptation a chance to stand apart. We don't just want a one-to-one shot recreation of it, because otherwise what's the point? Like, what are we doing here? In many ways, this adaptation succeeds by doing that, but it's also not that great either. It's plagued by some of the most functional, emotionless dialogue I've quite frankly ever heard. Feelings aren't felt, they're exposited. Plot takes precedence over character, and all the while I was left with such an empty feeling that made me frustrated. For every step forward, the show takes 2 steps back. In a word, Netflix's live-action Avatar: The Last Airbender is lifeless. But that's not what the Avatar is about. The Avatar is full of life. Being the Avatar is about peace, understanding, and trying to learn as much as you can about bending. But while trying to master the Avatar state, no easy feat, you're going to want to take some time to maybe hone some other skills as well. And there's no better place to do that than with this video sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is the place to learn about math, data analysis, programming, AI, I mean, you f***ing name it, even metal bending. Disclaimer, Brilliant does not have a metal bending course because that is not real. Much like finding your own way to learning bending by getting your favorite masters of the elements on your side, Brilliant is designed to help you. With courses built from the ground up with hands-on content that's been proven to be 6 times more effective than just watching a lecture. And Brilliant has assembled their own team of bending masters from all their fields with people coming from places like MIT and Microsoft. You won't have to travel to the Northern Water Temple to finally get the skills you're after because Brilliant works around your schedule and you can do these fun lessons whenever you want, wherever you want. All to help you build your problem-solving skills so you're not just mastering something like math, but becoming a better thinker overall. I've been really interested in their programming course because I took a lot of programming courses in college and I sucked at it, but with Brilliant, I actually get it. I get immersed in stuff like Python and learn essential coding skills that I can bring into the real world if I chose to become a programmer and dedicate my life to working in binary behind a computer for eternity. Yeah, that's not the career path for me. But you know what? You could do it because Brilliant says that you can do it. They've got a lot of great courses on there. What are you waiting for, guys? You already know how much I love Brilliant. I use them all the time. They've been a great sponsor to this channel. We couldn't do what we're doing without them. So try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days. Just go to brilliant.org/filmspeak or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Brilliant has the deals, guys. What are you doing? Take advantage of this. That's brilliant.org/filmspeak. And thank you so much to Brilliant, as always, for sponsoring this video. There is something very stiff about all of this. Not just because it's an animated show now stifled by the constraints of live action, but rather the dialogue and interactions all feel so utilitarian. I know it's not fair to compare something like the masterful Dune Part 2 to a Netflix adaptation of Avatar, but as my initial watch of Dune 2 coincided with me finishing up The Last Airbender, I couldn't help but think of Denis Villeneuve's recent statement about the art of no dialogue. Frankly, I hate dialogue, the filmmaker said in an interview with The Times of London. I don't remember movies because of a good line, I remember movies because of a strong image. I'm not interested in dialogue at all. Pure image and sound, that is the power of cinema, but it is something not obvious when you watch movies today. Now, I get it, he's talking about filmmaking, and specifically the theatrical experience, but I think this really applies to television as well. And while he does say that dialogue is for theater and television at the top of this interview, I do think that when you're dealing in a visual medium, like television, the rules of cinema do apply here as well. You just gotta kind of make it fit the confines of television, adapt it to that model. And obviously, people online took Denis' comments to the extreme and began citing some of their favorite movie lines and impactful dialogue exchanges that had just as profound an impact on them as a striking image. Like anything, this philosophy isn't absolute. Denis Villeneuve himself would be the first one to tell you that, but it is a philosophy I see less and less in film and especially television being made today, and that couldn't have been made more apparent while watching Avatar: The Last Airbender. Instead of spending the time to craft a sequence of images that convey Aang, Katara, Sokka, or Zuko's emotions, the show is so concerned with the audience getting it, that they place so little faith in said audience, instead opting to explain away what should be an emotional response. The show doesn't allow for the tools of the visual medium to do the talking, and that sucks, man. Some of the best moments of the animated show simply are the images, not just because it's a piece of hand-drawn art, but because those images hold weight and meaning. There's really none of that in this version, which severely hinders it from reaching its full potential, dulling the edge and adopting such a drab look. I'm not saying it's an ugly looking show. There are certainly beautiful CGI landscapes, villages, and wide shots that help create an aesthetically pleasing world. But it's conventionally attractive in the same way most AI-generated images are. Pretty renders with no soul underneath. It's all compounded by inconsistencies in the overall look of the show as well. Some environments are stunning backdrops, almost to the point where I'd rather just stare at them as screensavers than have action going on in front of them. And at the same time, others look like poorly rendered green screens. The bending and fight choreography in group sequences comes off really strong, featuring some intense sequences that had me saying, oh shit, every single time a firebender torched the hell out of a person. I mean, it's like, Jesus, man, it's pretty brutal to see at times. Meanwhile, the pivotal bending scenes, the big character beats, like the ones between Aang and Bumi or Katara and Pakku, lack any of the necessary heft required to make them stand out. I mean, these are massive character moments, and I get nothing. Absolutely nothing. Visually, these scenes seem softer, and for big personal moments in the show's story, they're less interesting to watch than scenes like the Air Nomad Massacre or Aang's escape from Admiral Zhao's imprisonment, which are just basic action scenes. And that really sums up the entire philosophy of Netflix's Avatar: The Last Airbender. When it's generic, sweeping action set pieces needed to progress the plot, the show manages to pull them off. But when it needs to be intimate, zeroing in on the characters and the trials they need to overcome, and it needs to feel earned and massive, it just absolutely flops. And that lack of intimacy was an anchor dragging this thing to the bottom of the fucking ocean as the show fought to stay afloat for the entirety of its brisk 8-episode journey. And speaking of anchors and ships, I couldn't help but be reminded of a show that got this right, a show that understood the soul of the work it was adapting, a show that embraced the isms of its animated predecessor and tried to use the language of live-action storytelling to create their own version of it. I'm of course talking about, yes, One Piece. I love it. The template for how you should adapt these shows into live action. As opposed to something like One Piece, which took great care in making sure the character interactions and mini arcs across the season were the most important parts, that you felt their bond, their pain, their love and camaraderie through side adventures that all factored into the main storyline, but were allowed to exist to deepen our emotional connection to the characters. Avatar is mainlining the proceedings hard. For a show that thrived on the intimate moments of group bonding, these relationships developing and growing found in side quests and character-oriented adventures that maybe didn't seem like they were factoring into the main story, this show is robbed of all of that. It's more interested in the epic nature and world-ending events at stake at the center of the show. But that's not why The Last Airbender is beloved. It's held a place in our hearts because of the characters and how we see them evolve and grow throughout the journey to restore balance to the world. Avatar is as great as it is because it's a coming-of-age story where our protagonists are confronted with their flaws, biases, arrogance, guilt, and ways of thinking, and evolve as a result of experiencing the world they're a part of. By existing in this world, helping others, and having time together to bond and learn about experiences they perhaps didn't know anything about prior, they're able to gain a greater sense of empathy for everything around them. They grow into maturity. That's why the show works. That's why it's stuck around in the pop culture zeitgeist for as long as it has and created lifelong fans. This isn't just an epic action-adventure property, it's a story about adolescence and the great, oftentimes unfair expectations thrust upon you at a point in time when you're just trying to figure yourself out. And yeah, the show kind of dives into that, specifically about war and how children are thrust into a world in conflict and the unfair burden of that conflict that weighs on them, thrust into maturity before they're ready while they're just trying to be kids, but also realizing that they have to kind of grow into themselves. The show does touch on that in an interesting way, but none of it really adds up or amounts to anything special. I think there are episodes, such as the Amashu arc or the Masks episode, where we really get an in-depth look at these people just trying to be people, about the obstacles they have to overcome, the responsibility they have to rise to take on. But it's never consistently tackled throughout the show. There are pops, glimmers of greatness throughout this, but never to the extent that we see in something like the animated series. Avatar is beautiful because we get to see these characters organically figure themselves out in an appropriate amount of time. It's not rushed. We're not just blowing through all of this stuff in order to hit plot points. No, we're able to see these characters that we love so dearly, that we grow attached to because they remind us of us or people that we know, embrace their destiny on their own terms in their own way. And that's relatable. We aren't told about it through dialogue. We fucking feel it. The Netflix version just lacks that level of authenticity and believability. I don't blame the actors for that because it's hard to sell some of this stuff that has to take on dual responsibility of exposition and character development. But, I mean, that's also the case with any show. Sadly, this is what happens when you take a 22-episode season and make it in 8-episode one. Even if the episodes are longer, I still feel like things are being rushed. This show never really settles. I mean, maybe for a couple of episodes here and there, but on the whole, it constantly feels like it can't be bothered to let us just be with the characters. That time is needed to flesh out the world, gradually introduce other elements, and allow for more natural character growth and interactions, and it's just not there enough. The show also doesn't allow for its more environmentalist commentary to come through, which is sort of the backbone of the animated show. On top of being a coming-of-age story, the animated show is about man's relationship with nature, and the balance we must strike not only as custodians of the natural world, but as a living part of that ecosystem. It's a show about discovering humility and recognizing one's place in the environment, not putting nature under your thumb in order to self-sustain and disrupting the natural order of things for your own selfish desires. I mean, why do you think the Fire Nation are depicted as industrialists? It's the fires of capitalism, baby. Yeehaw! The live-action show doesn't allow for such mature introspection because it's too concerned with getting you to the next plot point. If you're adapting Avatar, you need to, ironically, understand how to strike a balance between the episodes that drive the main story forward and the ones that build the world in which it happens. Every episode should be a lesson that adds to Aang's growth, eventually amounting to him becoming the Avatar. And while from episode 5 onward, we do get the thesis statement narrations that essentially recap the lesson Aang learned throughout the episode in a way reminiscent of the animated show, I couldn't help but feel confused as to why it took them so long to implement that and find their footing. When we get to that point, it almost feels like a completely different show from where we started. Many of the stops along the way to the Northern Water Tribe felt more like checks on a list of moments we need to hit to keep fans happy. All of those little pieces we've discussed, they all play a part in making the story feel whole and emotionally satisfying. You can't just rest on the epic mythos of the material because without that humanity, you only have a shell, an AI-generated copy of what was. I'm not saying it's unwatchable trash. There's clearly care that went into the costumes, production design, even performances. But it's rather icy and soulless by and large, which in turn gives off a rather fan-filmy vibe. That's the difference between something like this and, you guessed it, One Piece. One Piece had the goofy anime vibes that sometimes didn't translate well into live action and a bit of the plastic Netflix sheen to it, but the showrunners understood that the most important thing to successfully adapting the show were the characters, their conflict, their bond, and getting us emotionally invested in them and their adventures. The side adventures make the stakes of the main quest much more personal. The human moments, the ones that we can relate to, make the fantastical ones feel real as well. These moments are largely absent from Netflix's take on Aang's story. And while it may not be too noticeable in the moment, they're glaringly apparent when the late season payoffs come around, looking to cash in on the little to no buildup that they did in order to get there. While these scenes may seem like the first thing to cut when trying to make time for the main storyline, doing so means moments like this lose the potential weight and impact that they could have if they were built to correctly. Look, I love Momo. His presence in the original series as the silent slapstick comic relief always proved to lighten the mood of even the heaviest of episodes. This strained to inseparable relationship that Momo and Sokka share throughout the series is fantastic, and cutting that out from the live action show means that Momo's sacrificial dive bomb here doesn't quite feel earned or quite frankly needed. We have tons of Spirit World lore that's condensed down to one episode here. And while I'd say they do a good enough job introducing us to the Spirit World in episode 5 titled Spirited Away, there are moments of valuable character growth that are just skipped over to move the story along. Again, it felt like introducing the Spirit World and the beings that inhabit it was just another check mark on the list of things they felt needed to be included in order for the season finale to be what it is, but there was very little time spent exploring the potential within these locations. The gradual buildup of the show's spiritual elements that is so essential to the story felt organic in the original series, but here they just sort of cram it into one episode in an adventure that pits Aang against the predatory spirit Ko, which, by the way, didn't really have a satisfying ending in the episode that follows. They just sort of like, hey, Ko, here's your totem. All right, cool. See you later. Here's your friends. Like, what are we doing here, guys? We're told that Katara and Sokka are left to face some of their worst memories and nightmares, the things that torment them, the things that prevent them from becoming the people they're supposed to be while Aang is away. But we don't get to see any of that outside the initial capture. We don't get to see them overcome those obstacles. Instead, those two characters are just simply absent from episode 6 until their eventual rescue. Like I said, I think it's great understanding the baggage they carry with them and how that informs a lot of their character. But outside of understanding these people on that level, I never really feel like them overcoming that inner conflict is ever really earned. It just kind of happens because the audience understands what they're going through, so now they're just sort of able to be like, yeah, I'm just gonna make a change. And you really gotta work on that. You have to make it feel like they are overcoming this deep conflict that has bogged them down for as long as it has. And it's honestly such a damn shame for a few reasons. For starters, it undermines the overarching theme of the following episode titled Masks. The idea that what we show the world is often a cover for who we are and what we've experienced is a compelling concept. And while we sort of dig into this with Aang and Zuko on their buddy breakout mission, the chance to explore this concept within Sokka and Katara is missed entirely. Sure, we see the pain they carry underneath the surface, but they never confront it in any meaningful way. Katara just kind of has a battle with an elder waterbender, and it's like, cool, I've overcome my trauma. And then Sokka has a conversation with a princess later on, and he overcomes his trauma. We lose out on a much-needed moment in the journey of both of our favorite Water Tribe siblings. Before the show was even released, you know, we already heard about the fact that they were going to make Sokka a little bit less of a fuckboy, and that is fine if you want to alter a character to keep them a little more current with our present world, I guess, but I think there's a point being missed by doing so. Sokka's growth through all 3 of the original series seasons is tremendous, and part of that is learning that being a leader doesn't have to coincide with being a man, and that being a man doesn't necessarily mean having to act all macho all the time. it's a status quo that Katara faces head-on when confronting Pakku about his sexist traditional ways once the gang reaches the Northern Water Tribe. But when you cut that part out of Sokka's character, we miss out on a valuable chance for his own character to grow in that confrontation as well. For Katara, this climactic face-off with a water-bending master just seems to fall flat on its face. I mean, it's so horribly unearned because Katara is kind of just a nothing character throughout much of the series. She mentions to Pakku that she's faced off with Fire Nation soldiers in an attempt to prove her point, but truthfully, this adaptation didn't show many of these aforementioned altercations prior to this moment. Fans of the original will know it to be true, but it's not fair for us as viewers to fill in these gaps based on our knowledge of the source material. The adaptation does, however, include the lessons she learns from Jet and his crew. She learns through his morally questionable acts not to let the past define her. She learns to let go of her burning hatred and move past it. She learns to let her memory of her mom not be the moment she died, but instead be how she lived. And I think that part of Katara's journey in the live-action adaptation was shockingly well done. Though, as fans of the original series know, that anger will definitely rear its ugly head again in later seasons, showing that forgiveness is never a once-and-done concept. It's something you work at every day. But again, I don't know if that'll ever come up again, because it feels like, once again, these incredibly complex characters are being compressed into two-dimensional caricatures of their formerly animated selves. Katara is an amazingly strong character in the animated series, not just as a fighter, but as a person as well. She constantly fights to break through what others tell her is right or wrong, and persists in finding her own moral compass despite how the world has told her to think. In fact, Aang, Sokka, and Katara all fight against what previous generations tell them they should be. Sokka struggles to figure out what being a leader really means. Katara fights the state and outdated gender norms of her own people, and Aang pushes back against generations of avatars that have come before him to prove to them that he doesn't have to save the world alone, that he doesn't have to follow the path that other people have gone down just because it's the way that they have done it. He can carve out his own way. He can be his own person despite the generations of people that also live within him. That's partially why cutting out the final confrontation with Ko and converting it into a lightly grazed narration-led conclusion undermines each of these three once wonderfully complex characters' individual arcs. Again, there are glimpses of all of this going on there, of shattering the status quo, specifically through Aang, and I think they do a decent enough job of it in here, which is why it's not complete trash. But there are moments like with the Ko stuff where I'm just like, what? Why wouldn't you? The original series, as many of you know, started its story in the present, following Sokka and Katara as they stumbled upon a boy frozen in a globe of ice. The only context we get from the events of the past are those that were told by Katara in the title sequence's narration. It wasn't until later in the first season that we started to chip away at what had actually happened before Aang Steve Rogers'd himself into the ocean. The Netflix series, however, makes the decision to start earlier, introducing us to Aang, showing us the air nomads in all their glory, and having us watch in horror as they get Order 66 by the Fire Nation. The best thing that Netflix has going for it, especially when adapting a show that had already been done for a visual medium, is that it can bank on its viewers already knowing the characters, their story, and where they ultimately end up. They have the knowledge of what happened prior and can kind of weave that in a bit earlier so that things feel like they flow a bit better. And that's more of a benefit to the creatives involved than it is to the viewers per se. It does allow the adaptation some wiggle room in cutting a few fatty parts out while adding new scenes that actually add to the characters and the story they're telling, showing events such as the attack on the air nomads that we had only heard about prior to this series' release. That being said, while I do think it was cool that we get to see this event unfold for the first time on screen, I don't think it's a great starting place for the series. It kind of, in my mind at least, diminishes Aang's journey of discovery and regret following his reawakening in the story's present day. On top of that, Aang's motivation for running from the Southern Air Temple was his fear of responsibility, not wanting to fight in a world on the verge of war. In the adaptation, his motivations feel weaker. His leave from the temple is treated more or less as a walk to clear his head, and we know that from the get-go. So while I understand his guilt for not being around to help his friends to make a difference, I'm also well aware that it wasn't his fault. His guilt is misplaced, and the show treats it as if he willfully abandoned everyone when that very clearly wasn't the case. What's so great about the way the animated show handles this is that we don't entirely know what happened at the beginning. We find out about the tragedy that befell the air nomads later in the show. Showing it so early on actually works against this adaptation because it sort of removes the mystery of it all, and it weakens Aang's journey of self-discovery because we've already seen him as a person. We already realize that he just kind of like went on a walk to clear his head, and so he is quite literally not guilty, even though he's harboring this guilt. So when the big revelations come in the live action adaptation, when Aang finds out about the airbenders and how they died while he was away, it feels like we're retreading something that we've already understood, and we're already well aware that Aang shouldn't be carrying this guilt with him. Part of why the pilot of the animated series is so effective is because it's shrouded in mystery. We know the broad strokes, the essentials, enough to give us a clear picture of the world and the conflict that consumed it, but we don't need to know about the stuff that kind of happens there until much later. Because when Aang finds out what happened to the air nomads, and he realizes it's because he ran away from his responsibility, and we find out in that moment it's because he ran away from his responsibility. That is so much more impactful because now we understand that his guilt is not misplaced. It's well-founded, actually, tragically so. And so now him having to overcome that guilt becomes so much more impactful as opposed to just the typical, like, oh, I feel guilty because I wasn't there to help my friends. Like, you just lose that weight because of the way they chose to order these things and the way they chose to tell this story in a more traditionally linear fashion. But you know what? Like I said, this show isn't all bad. There are some additions that actually enhance the overall narrative and the characters, and it mainly has to do with the Fire Nation. Fire Lord Ozai, Azula, Iroh, Zuko, all of these characters are greatly enhanced by this live-action adaptation. Including more of Ozai and his deep Rolodex of family drama from the very beginning was honestly a great decision, in my opinion. Bringing in Azula earlier and making Zuko's banishment as much of a fucked up lesson for her as it was a punishment for him is a great starting point to fleshing out this sibling rivalry. And while there were many payoffs that didn't quite land in the season finale because they chose to sow the seeds of Azula earlier on, this scene certainly struck its intended chord.
Ozai was just using you as motivation for your sister.
Another aspect that I think this adaptation really fucking nails, I mean, I would say even improves upon, is the early relationship between Zuko and Uncle Iroh. With the show's focus on war and what it takes from those involved, the adaptation's choice to include more of Uncle Iroh's story earlier on is arguably one of the strongest decisions it makes. Fans of the original will most likely already know what the war cost Iroh and... Stop! What'd I say? No, not during this video. I'm not gonna get emotional. Not gonna do it. Not gonna do it. Anyway, as I said earlier, one of the strongest parts of the new show is the inclusion of scenes we've never seen before. Most notably, in this case, the series of events which led to Iroh's bond with his nephew and his eventual decision to accompany Zuko on his mission. The sacrifices Zuko made and that Iroh made in order for their lives to be better. The series boasts multiple scenes, such as Iroh's son's funeral, that not only have we never seen before, but also showcase the amazing relationship between our favorite uncle and his nephew. Iroh also reveals one of the best new additions to the series, which is being the one to tell Lieutenant G and the audience that the crew aboard Zuko's ship wouldn't be alive if it weren't for Zuko's intervention and eventual banishment. He didn't want these young soldiers to be sent out to die. He opted to use his privilege and power to do something, to save their lives, but it cost him everything. It cost his father to discard him. So that's something that he kind of lives with, and it's something that Iroh recognizes. I just found that to be such a beautiful moment and a great character beat for Zuko. And I really love how Iroh uses the opportunity of Zuko's banishment to show him what the world is really like outside of the Fire Nation, and in turn, Zuko has a better understanding of the problems with the Fire Nation, their hypocrisy, the way that the world sort of operates without honor, even amongst the ranks of the Fire Nation, and that doesn't really sit well with him, and you slowly see that chip away at Zuko throughout the course of this series. Again, like, that stuff is so powerful, him coming to have a more realistic understanding of what his people have done to this world and how this world actually operates. And I think it's what causes him to have a better connection with Aang when he eventually rescues him from Admiral Zhao. Zuko was always one of my favorite characters in the show's original run. Hell, I'd go as far as to say that he probably has one of the best villain redemption arcs ever. And it happened in a show made for kids, which is just insane to me. What the series does really well is depict hope in different forms with different characters, how it can both inspire and destroy people. For Zuko, it's the hope of returning home that drives him, of earning that love and respect of his father. He lacks it so desperately, and even the tiniest sliver of hope will drive him towards an outcome that will only ruin him in the end, which is exactly what his uncle tells him. His father banished him, sending him to find the Avatar, assuming and borderline knowing full well that he would fail, that he'd never return home. And Iroh knows that, because even if he were to find the Avatar, it would just be motivation for his sister. He would never actually be allowed back into the kingdom of the Fire Nation. For Aang, he's the hope people have for a better world, one where people of different walks of life can live harmoniously and connect with one another. Aang brings that out of people. He is what everyone aspires to be. As I've kind of already mentioned, it's clear that the creatives involved wanted to put a focus on war and its effects on those involved as the forefront of the series' intended message. While I still feel that many important parts of the original series were cut out, the parts that were kept in have a heavy focus on different people's reactions to surviving during wartime. From Suki and her merry band of women to Jet and his merry band of, well, the show calls them terrorists, but that's a questionable choice. We see not only the spectrum of survival that many folks have adapted to, but are also reminded that these characters are kids, teenagers at most, children forced to lose their innocence at such a young age, called to fulfill the duties of their time. It's truthfully the best direction this adaptation could have gone in. It's a great way of reimagining this story, of making it a bit more serious, more geared towards the sensibilities of live action storytelling, and I gotta commend them on that. At the end of the day, Netflix's Avatar might look pretty, but there's really not much else going on for it. You know, aside from a few things here and there. It's just ultimately empty. It's easy to see why the original creators left the series. It's a show made by people who are fans of the idea of Avatar, but don't really get what the original series stood for. You have a show that seems to want to focus its message on the effects of war and how these literal children respond to it, while at the same time peppering in fan-servicey character traits like Sokka's comical obsession with food, which just kind of comes in here or there. It's really inconsistent. Ultimately, choosing to rewrite the story with a much more serious view on the Fire Nation's tyranny is a strong choice, and the inclusion of checklist fan service dilutes that prior stance. Listen, I know it's incredibly tough to live up to the already sky-high expectations held by fans of a show that pretty much nailed it the first go-around, but there's still much left to be desired in Netflix's take on the Avatar story. I don't believe it would be judged so harshly if the series featured a completely original story based on the world created by Michael and Brian, but if you're going to retell an already perfect story, you kind of need to ask yourself, what can we add to the story by telling it in live action versus animation? And focus on that. And it sort of just left me feeling unsatisfied. What's the point of rehashing the same story to the same audience if you have nothing new to say? Until you figure that out, your new version of an old story will always end up feeling, well, lifeless.